www.ecological.org/ANH2020. Before Todd takes the conversation forward, I have a few technical announcements to ensure our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible. This session will be recorded and posted on the ANH Academy website following the conference. All participants have been muted, but please introduce yourselves using the chat function. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organisation you work with. You can access the chat box by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We encourage you to share your webcam video feed during this session, but if you don't have the right bandwidth or you prefer not to, you can put a profile picture if you are logged into your own Zoom account by right-clicking on your name. Later in the session, we'll open up the conversation with Q&A. If you have questions, please share them in the chat box throughout the session, and we'll do our best to raise them at the end. If we have time, we may also ask participants to raise their hands so we can call on you to speak your question aloud. If at any point you experience technical issues, please check your audio settings and your internet connection. You can always try to reconnect to the session using the same Zoom link. If you have a technical question, please send me a private message using the chat box and I will try to fix it. Thank you so much, and over to you, Todd.
Great, thanks, Lauren, and welcome to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on wherever you are. For me, you'll see the sun is just rising here in Western Washington State in the United States. And so thanks for joining this important and exciting session. And thanks for reading to the end of the program. We have a really exciting group of speakers today, really touching on all aspects and many of these aspects of climate change, seasonality, and spatial studies. We have Martin Broadley from the University of Nottingham. We have Emily Amondo from the University of Bonn, Josiah Mwangi-Ateka from Jomo Kenyatta, and Naomi Saville from the University College London. And so what I would like to challenge both the speakers as well as those in our session today is to really think broadly, because these speakers will touch along very specific aspects in some very detailed studies, and think about broadly how we can connect these studies to the broader climate change crisis, to the broader, even the COVID crisis, and think about what we need to do to push this area of the agriculture, nutrition, and health academy forward. And with that, so the format, as Lauren had mentioned, will be 3 to 4 minutes for each speaker to reintroduce their research. Hopefully many of you have already watched the videos that have been posted online, and then we'll go into question and answer. The first questions and answers will be, please post them into the chat, and then we will open it up for Q&A where you will be able to raise your hand, okay? And with that, let's start with Martin. So over to you, Martin.
Thanks very much, Todd. So yes, hello everyone. My name's Martin Broadley. I'm actually presenting on behalf of Adamu Bile today, because unfortunately there's been some security issues in Addis over the last couple of days, and the internet is problematic there. So Adamu is the primary author of this study, which is selenium deficiency is widespread and spatially dependent in Ethiopia. So I found a picture of Adamu to share with you all, so that you know who Adamu is. And I should also flag that Adamu's lead supervisor is Dr. Daud Gashu from Addis University, but also he couldn't present because of the same internet challenges. So it's great because I'm trying to do this. I found out this morning, so 3 minutes is okay. But I thought if I just flagged that this work has been just published last month in the journal Nutrients. So if I could encourage people to go and do a quick search for nutrients, selenium and Adamu Bile's name, and then you can find out all the details about what Adamu was going to talk about today. But in very simple terms, what this represents is work conducted in collaboration with EPHI Public Health Institute in Ethiopia, looking at their micronutrient survey from 2015 and looking at measuring selenium in the serum samples that were collected during that survey. This represents around 360 locations, enumeration areas of clusters, in which households were surveyed for lots of different micronutrients, and that's how they were distributed across Ethiopia. Selenium is an important micronutrient for all sorts of reasons, immune function, one of them. If we look at the cluster means now for what this looks like in terms of serum selenium concentration, it goes from the light coloured dots through to the dark coloured dots being the highest selenium concentrations. And then what we do is work with geostatistics experts to try and see what the variation is and what our confidence can be in those cluster means. Obviously, there's multiple layers of spatial information in these surveys. And these are the Kriging variances that come out of those cluster mean analyses. And basically down here in the Somali region of Ethiopia, you can see that the variance is very great compared to some of the other areas in Ethiopia. And that's to do with the density of sampling that's been conducted during that stratified micronutrient survey. We can then do things like Kriging, and hopefully on this figure you can now see some of the features appearing here. So these darker purple areas are areas where serum selenium concentration is much greater, and these tend to be co-localizing into the Rift Valley area of Ethiopia at these particularly large concentrations. But actually what we then do is we use the probabilities and understandings of some of these uncertainties to start to compare the likelihood of an individual in a location being above or below a particular threshold, which is a biomarker of sufficiency. And in this case, it hopefully looks a little bit clearer now. So this is the likelihood of being below a threshold for what one of the selenium proteins is in the human system in blood plasma. And now you can see these spatial features now appearing where as you get these orangey brown areas, you can see that you're very likely or virtually certain to be below the threshold for selenium sufficiency against this particular biomarker. Whereas if you're in the blue areas or the green areas, you're very unlikely to be deficient for those biomarkers. And with that, I will stop. Thank you. You're on mute, Todd.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks for keeping time as well. And so we'll go directly over to Emily, and we'll take clarifying and other questions after all four speakers.
Hi everyone, my name is Emilia Mondo. This is work that I did together with my colleague Alicia. Okay, and my research topic is on whose health is affected by climate variability, evidence from households in rural Uganda. And our study basically explored the relationship between extreme weather events, that is both precipitation extremes, as well as temperature with children nutritional health outcome, while at the same time identifying the cost effect transmission mechanism. We focus mainly on root risks arising from climate change. And particularly we use secondary panel data sources. Our child health data and socioeconomic as well as agriculture comes from Uganda National Panel Survey, which is part of LSMS. And our rainfall, we download monthly rainfall from 1981 to the respective panel waves, while temperature we download from 2000 to the respective waves. These weather data sources are used to construct the objective measures for climate variability. We also triangulate our flood, whether a household experience flood or shock, drought shock or flood shock. In our empirical analysis, we use panel fixed effects, controlling for other factors. The graph shows the climate trend from 1986.
Emily, we have
in terms of annual rainfall and temperature, and we see that the trend was not quite stable. And in our result, these are descriptive. It shows distribution of mean height for HZ scores vis-a-vis the different categories of rainfall, and we can see low has scores, especially for the children households. Sorry, you lost me?
Yes, Emily,
you're back, Emily. Please proceed.
Did you lose me?
No, you're back. We lost you for 1 minute, but I think you can continue. You're sounding okay now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Emily. Can you please continue? Can you hear us?
Stop. Maybe let me stop video. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I was on video, so when I try to at least stop video now, at least you can hear me. Oh, this graph, I'm back. Okay. The graph shows the mean for XZ scores, or height for XZ scores. Yes, under extreme dry conditions. And then, wow, now my...
Emily, maybe we can move on to Josiah and we will come back to you, and hopefully that the internet will become more stable.
The next graph shows the
where
temperatures vis-a-vis and different under nutrition measures, that is stunting, underweight, and wasting, vis-a-vis the first lag of heat wave. And we can see in 2010 when the heat wave was so high, that's when the stunting was high. And our regression generally shows that there was significant negative outcomes for high XZ scores, it's moderate and extreme drought. Okay. Okay, no problem. Okay.
Emily, we'll try to
I hope
come back to you.
Yes, and so I hope everybody's getting their questions ready for Emily based on her presentation, because there's a lot of meat in there that we need to unpack during the question and answer. Josiah, maybe we can move to you and hope the internet holds out. Please proceed, Josiah.
Yeah, okay, no problem.
Josiah, all right.
I think Josiah is potentially having connection issues also.
Okay. One strike, two strikes. Naomi, how about can we move to you and move you up in the order? It sounded like your internet was okay.
Okay, thanks, Todd. And good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone. Can you see my slides? I just want to be sure that people can see.
We can see them. Can you put them in slideshow format so they're larger?
Yeah, I've just done that. I don't know whether it's showing because I'm joining from Nepal, and like my other colleagues on this call, we're all a little bit challenged by the internet connectivity. But let's see how it goes. If it's not very good, let me know and I can turn my video off. So thanks very much for the opportunity to share my research on seasonality of neonatal and maternal nutrition in the plains of Nepal. And just before I start, I want to acknowledge all my co-authors mentioned here on this slide, and also our donors, David and the Leverhulme Trust, and other people involved in the parent study where we collected the data. So the objectives of this study was to try and provide, using some data from the low birth weight South Asia trial, we wanted to provide a more comprehensive seasonal analysis of maternal and newborn nutrition. So women in this environment are subject to many seasonal stresses. It's very hot for much of the year. We have a rainy season, a monsoon where there's very high humidity. Women are exposed to heat stress. There are peaks of labor at the times of harvesting and planting of crops. We have a lean season, and then it can get very cold and damp in the winter as well. So we used cosigner analysis, which I don't have time to go into, but we used cosigner analysis to generate seasonal curves for these outcomes. So what we found was that almost every outcome that we examined had either annual or half yearly, what we call semestral seasonality, or in some cases there was both annual and semestral seasonality. So, so just looking at some of the graphs that we were able to generate, one of the main key takeaways I wanted you to have from my presentation is that the shape of these curves is so different depending on the outcome. So seasonality is affecting so many different eating behaviors and so many different outcomes, but all in different ways. So for example, we have very lower dietary diversity in the hot season. We have lower eating occasions per day in the winter. We have possibly due to heat stress, we have higher eating less during pregnancy, higher vomiting, higher food aversion in the hottest time of year in May and June. When we look at the intake of food groups, we see that some food groups have higher consumption when it's season harvest time. Other food groups have higher production, say like in the monsoon, dairy peaks in the monsoon time, whereas meat and fish are peaking in the festival season here in early pregnancy. So you can see different groups have different patterns. And then for how does all of this eating behavior and heat stress and all the different workloads, how does this translate into the thinness of women at different times of year? So whilst early pregnancy didn't show up such a clear pattern, in late pregnancy we saw that women are thinnest at the time of year when food insecurity is worst. And then what we see is that the children's length, the length for AZ scores here are lowest in the winter. So that has tracked onto the thinness in women has tracked onto the thinness in children. And if we compare the different nutritional outcomes, what we found was that the head circumference for AZ score was didn't have any really significant seasonality, whereas thinness, the length for AZ score was much lower in the summer compared to in the winter. So just my final conclusions, seasonal patterns can be detected in pregnant mothers and their eating behavior and their food group intake. Newborns are born short and less thin in the winter and thin and less short in the pre-monsoon. And so we feel that seasonality should be taken into account in planning and implementing research, nutrition and research in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Naomi. Very interesting and very important last conclusion there that we hopefully will be able to unpack a little bit as we go forward. Josiah, I'm wondering if we might try to come back to you now, see if the internet is working a little bit better, and see if you can give your three minute intervention at this point.
Well, thank you, Chair. Sorry for the interruption. My name is Josiah Ateka. I'm presenting work that we've been doing together with my colleague, Dr. Robert Imbeje, who is already joined in. We're looking at forests and food that derived our motivation from the fact that there is a significant number of people who are not able to access adequate food. And we also recognize the fact that there is a significant number of people, about 300 million, who heavily depend on forests, and also proceeded with the motivation that yes, there is some recognition of what forests can contribute in the food system, but the specific pathways and nature and extent of the relationship between forests or forest dependence and food and nutrition security is not very well understood. We responded to 3 key questions, but a key one is what is the effect of forest dependence on food security and nutrition, and also wanted to understand what is the nature and the extent of forest dependence. We did this work in a protected forest area in Western Kenya, the Mount Elgon region. This is an area with a history of forest degradation, but also a history of food insecurity and malnutrition. We use two indicators of food security. We use the food insecurity experience scale and household dietary diversity score, and used a set of Poisson regressions. And from our results, we find an interesting result, yes, that there is a significant number of our sample, about 65% who depend on forests. And when we disaggregate this, we found very interesting results that there are differences in terms of the value of products that are extracted from forests between male-headed households and female-headed households. Specifically, we find that actually men were extracting significantly much more value from firewood, while women were getting much more value from vegetables, and the differences were statistically significant. And when we ran a set of regressions to look at the impacts of the effects of forest dependence on food security, we find that forests extraction actually has an important, as a positive impact. It can reduce both food security and enhance household dietary diversity. From our results, we derive important key messages. One is we found actually that there are high levels of vulnerability to food security in the study area. We found also that there are gender differences in terms of the extent to which people are depending on forests, and also conclude that, yes, forest dependence is important for food security and nutrition. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Josiah. And Emily, can we come back to you to finish off this initial section of the session?
Okay, let me try. Okay, I hope you can hear me. Okay,
Yes, we're getting you.
graph. Okay, the graph shows the annual rainfall and temperature in Uganda from 1986 to 2016. And we can see that rainfall and temperature was not quite stable. And this graph shows the distribution of mean height for HZ scores vis-a-vis the different categories of rainfall. We constructed rainfall indicator using the objective weather measures. And we find that under conditions of extreme dry, that's when the mean height for HZ scores was less. And looking at different undernutrition measures, that is wasting, underweight, and stunting, vis-a-vis the first lag of heat wave, we find that in 2010, when heat wave was high, that's when stunting was high. Our empirical analysis shows significant negative outcomes for HAS with both extreme and moderate, and also extreme wet spell and heat wave in the first lag, fifth lag, and 5-year cumulative heat count. Also, weight for HZ scores, though this one was only significant in the fifth lag, and white for height Z scores in previous season variables. And since we tested different transmission mechanisms, we found out that heat waves, drought, and high rainfall variability negatively affected crop output, while increases in temperature and dry spell increased the probability of diarrhea. We also had control for different coping and adaptation strategies, and we found out that ex-ante strategies such as precautionary saving were associated with better health outcomes, while exposed ones such as involuntary change of diet were associated with negative health outcomes. And furthermore, we found out that households that engaged in water harvesting, crop diversification, improved seed and pesticide use had better crop output, and the household that practiced better improved water, sanitation, and hygiene condition. Therefore, we conclude by saying that right adaptation strategies indeed help in smoothing the negative effects of climate change and variability. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks for working through the technical challenges challenges. It was great. And so we'll start to go to the questions, and I see a number of questions coming in. As I mentioned in the introduction, one of my goals is to broaden this discussion and see how this information can, and all the evidence that we've just seen and that you've seen in the videos, links climate, land use, environmental degradation to nutrition. We're going to really focus on questions that sort of speak to those kinds of issues and linking that to the broader ANH agenda. And so in that vein, maybe I'll start with the first question to Naomi. You found that seasonality has various effects on measurements of health. Besides being aware of this during interventions, how can you see this influencing future work? And what are the implications of this work beyond?
So I think starting with research work, I think often we see people do surveys of nutritional status or nutritional studies, and they don't necessarily always do them at the same time of year. And I think our study shows very, very clearly that going forwards, people need to, if they wanted to compare two different time points or something, they really should be comparing the same season of the year. As far as design of interventions is concerned, I think if we're doing a nutritional intervention, we really need to be thinking about when are the times that food availability, for example, might affect how the intervention might be taken up, and also what the various stresses might be upon the participants, you know, in terms of workload or other aspects of seasonality. I think from a climate change point of view, I mean, these seasonal patterns that we observed this year might not be the same in other years. I mean, that was one of the justifications of using the cosigner analysis instead of defining seasons and saying this is the rainy season or this is the hot season, but using the cosigner analysis, which was based upon the day of the year, so that you could detect patterns which might be happening at different times at in different years. Thank you.
And I think that question is also has implications for Emily in your work. So I don't know if you wanted to comment, Emily, on this question as well. So again, sort of what are the implications for work beyond the particular particular interventions? And that question's to Emily.
All right. Yeah, as Naomi had indicated, of course, there are different, nowadays there are different changes in seasons, and you find that whatever was there previously is not what is happening currently. For instance, if I take an example of Uganda, you find out that in the late 2010, for the period of my study, the main extreme weather event that was occurring was drought. But in the recent past, we find that floods have been on increase, both in terms of frequency and intensity. So when designing the intervention, I think you have to look at the past climatic shocks and the current climatic shocks, which will inform this particular kind of intervention that you want to put forward.
And just as a follow-on to that, Emily, are there interventions that are climate shock neutral that you could envisage would benefit populations regardless of what climate shocks that they may face? Because as you just mentioned, these may vary depending on the year.
Yeah, okay, for climate neutral intervention, that's the question. If there are any climate neutral intervention.
Are there any nutrition interventions that are able, or which nutrition interventions would you suggest are able to address multiple climate shocks that might have different effects on sort of the pathways between agriculture, nutrition, and health?
Okay, multiple intervention that should be used to address the different climate shocks depending on the different type of years. I would say that here I find out that in Uganda that the government specifically gives aids to areas that experience drought shock, especially in the northeastern region. And this food aid is also given to people who experience flood shocks, especially in the eastern region. So I found out that giving food stocks, at least to the people who are experiencing these dry and flood events, have the same effect. And also supplemental feeding. For instance, mothers are usually given food that are rich in nutrients that will help them in their feeding of their babies, especially when they experience the drought shock as well as the flood shocks.
Thank you, Emily. And so the next question is sort of aimed at Martin, but is perhaps relevant for all panelists. So here goes. How does food trade play a role in understanding the link between issues in the soil, local environment, and nutritional outcomes? And is this taken into consideration, or perhaps it doesn't matter for the region that you are studying? And Martin, this is to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. So the survey that was done in Ethiopia was the standard micronutrient survey. We also last year published work on the Malawi micronutrient survey as well. So you don't get certainly the seasonal dynamics built in there, but what you will see at the biomarker level is, if you like, the integrated effects of all of the nutritional inputs. So in that sense, it's reporting what's being consumed, with the element selenium particularly, but also other mineral nutrients such as iodine that are under very strong spatial control. You are seeing a very strong reflection of local environment based on likely consumption patterns of locally produced cereals primarily. So the primary staples in Malawi being maize, and in Ethiopia being teff, wheat, maize, barley, sorghum, more diverse. You're still seeing a very strong sort of local driver and a local signature in the biomarker of status, which is linked very, very strongly to soil type and lots of different factors within that.
And Josiah, a question came through for you. What are the main underlying factors of forest dependence in the two counties? And are there ongoing interventions by the governments of the two counties to reduce forest dependence, say in the agricultural space?
Thank you. I think a good question. I want to respond first by recognizing that I want to begin with the second question that is asking whether there are interventions to reduce forest dependence, and want to say that perhaps the issue is not so much whether to reduce the dependence, but then how do we get people to engage in sustainable forest extraction or sustainable forest dependence. One of the other things I wanted to say is that there is the shift or the change in forest management towards more participatory approaches. This is where you are getting members of the communities to be engaged more in the management of the forest. And this change in governance does actually allow members of the community to engage and extract some products from the forest, including engaging in certain forms of production, especially at the initial levels of communities can be assigned plots within the forest where they can produce certain crops until maybe the replanted trees are able to form canopy. Having said that, I want to indicate that our results showed that there are a number of factors that influence the level of forest dependence among the communities that we engaged with. And a number of these would relate to household level characteristics. This would either be gender differences. There would be level of resources or socioeconomic status in terms of the wealth level, and other market-related factors or transaction cost-related variables. But more importantly, for me, the message would be that the discussion is much more about how can we make the communities to engage in sustainable forest extraction or sustainable forest management, and not so much how we get them not to depend on forests. My colleague with whom we were doing this work, Dr. Robert Impeche, is in this meeting. Perhaps maybe he has a comment or two. Kindly, Chair.
Yes, Robert has made a comment in the chat for any of those following along there. So just building on Josiah's question, but just picking up on something that you mentioned, Josiah, what I didn't hear was sort of the environmental effects. So there's questions coming in that are asking, did the study find any impacts of deforestation on forest extraction, for instance?
Perhaps the study quite focused more on looking at how the interaction between dependence and food security and nutrition. But I also want to say that part of the communities that we engage with are members who are participating in programs that are operating under the broad framework that I mentioned, that is participatory forest management. And if there are impacts, I would link them more to positive impacts in terms of number of or hectares of trees that have been replanted, because this is one of the activities that the project is engaged in. And outside the forest, we also found evidence that there is actually quite a number of the participants who are engaging in own forestry activities in terms of planting trees outside the forest. And we also tried to check on changes in terms of the diversity of or the number of tree species that are being established. And I would say the indication is that the impacts are positive.
Great, thanks. And just one last follow-up for you, but I'm hoping to use this question as a springboard into the other speakers as well. One of the questions, part of the original question asked to you was about sort of government interventions and government activities that are supporting or hindering forest use. And so I'm wondering how the government and policies are affecting forest use in the study. And I think this question can also go to the other panelists as well. So not only how governments and policies are affecting the interventions that you're working on, but also how you are interfacing with the governments to help change and inform policy. So that will be coming to each of the panelists after Josiah. Josiah, please go ahead if you'd like to jump in.
Oh, thank you. In terms of the policy regime, as I indicated, the new policy regime in Kenya does provide or the change or the framework from what was previously a protectionist or a control-based approach to a more participatory system. And so what government is trying to do is implementing a number of programs, some of them ecosystem payment, based on the payment for ecosystem services approach. But one of the concerns we found engaging with the communities is there is still a lot of administrative influence, so that while communities are expected to engage in conservation or supporting forest protection activities, there are still a number of gaps, one of which is that this has not been followed with adequate resource provision. So the communities are engaged to develop forestry management plans on how they can conserve forests, on how they can protect the forests, and but then the capacity in terms of the resources or the technical know-how is still limiting. So there are still a number of there's still a lot of opportunity for what policy can do to be able to to scale up the impacts. So what broadly exists is more of an intention, yes, that we can let people collectively participate in forestry management, but when you engage with discussions with communities and interviews, that emerges as one of the key gaps. And there is opportunity on how practically can some of this new thinking be implemented.
Great. Thanks, Josiah. And maybe I'll skip directly to Naomi. How is your results? It seem pretty important for nutrition interventions. How are these being integrated either into local or national government and policies and actual programs?
So these results are relatively new. I submitted the paper. Well, I just submitted the revisions to the journal a couple of weeks ago. So they're relatively new. I think as we go forward, we're hoping probably to write some policy briefs, things like this 7-minute presentation that I prepared. I would certainly aim to be sharing that during this time of COVID and social distancing. I'll be sharing that with I'm quite active in the nutrition cluster, which is responding to a nutrition emergency. So I'll probably share that with all the cluster members. I mean, going forwards, we'd be holding dissemination events and so on to try and share the results. As far as for us in devising new studies and new interventions, I'm currently involved in a cluster randomized trial looking at anemia in pregnancy. So these results are really informative for us to help us to understand times of low dietary diversity, of when food groups might be, people might be compromised in trying to improve their dietary intake, and then looking for alternative foods we might be able to recommend to pregnant women to focus on. If for example green leafy vegetables are less available, then we'd be looking for an alternative iron-rich food to recommend to them to take at that particular time. So there's a lot of work yet to do in getting these results out, but that's the main kind of approach that we use. Thanks.
Perfect, thanks. And I'm going to stick with you just for another second, Naomi, and maybe dive down. There's a question about, are the seasonal effects different in different ecological zones of Nepal?
Yeah, so I think it was Ed that asked this question, and thanks very much for a really good question there. I mean, we haven't done the modeling, the cosigner analysis on other ecozones because we don't have the data available. We were very lucky to have this cluster randomized trial with 25,000 women enrolled, where we were able to have large samples, where we were able to conduct these analyses. But just from my understanding of the context in Nepal, I would say, for example, the heat stress issues that we expect to be exerted on women would be very different once you get up into the mountains. I mean, there it's more cold stress in the winter, very dry conditions during the winter, not so damp. In the Terai, in the plains, we have a lot of high humidity in the winter through fog. But in the mountains, the cold is very dry. So, the climatic effects would be different, but also the changes in the dietary diversity would be different, because in the mountains you can't grow things at the very high altitude. You can't grow vegetables through the winter. So people's dietary diversity and intake of those food groups would be vastly different from what it is in the plains. Also, the morbidities would probably be different. But I think one thing I would expect is that thinness amongst children is probably highest in the rainy season. That seems to be a pattern which is quite common in all the different agroecological zones of Nepal. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Naomi. And coming over to you, Emily, sort of building on the question around engagement with governments, engagement with practitioners. You did you showed evidence from a very nice interdisciplinary study where you're talking about climate and you're talking about nutrition. So naturally you would be have access or be thinking about the ministries of environment, the ministries of health. What kind of strategies can you suggest for those on the call and in the discussion about how to engage and get this type of cross-institutional information into the decision makers' hands, that either that you've used with this study or that you've been a part of in the past?
Okay. Okay, since my study is interdisciplinary kind of study, yeah, most of the results or recommendations that I alluded to, I have not yet published them. But then the main way to ensure that these recommendations, of course, are incorporated with so many decision makers, is to have a kind of participatory engagement. Currently, yeah, since my study, the one I presented was based on purely secondary data sources. Currently, we are doing another study, a primary. We are collecting data with the universities here in Uganda, Makerere, which is under College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences. So we hope that by the end of our study, the current one will be able to invite different stakeholders and try to disseminate the information that we've gotten. But then based on some of the policy recommendations that I alluded to, like crop diversification, improve the input use, most of the things that the government is doing here in Uganda is try to promote subsidies, giving improved seed to farmers, especially those who are challenged in terms of weather, so that they ensure that they have improved crop output. And also the government is doing well in dissemination of information, encouraging farmers to do crop diversification, to diversify, so that at the end of the day, at least they have diversified food items on their plates. Yeah, that's basically my view. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you. And Martin, I'll ask you one last question. And I put in the chat, we're going to go to raising hands after this question to Martin. So if you have a question, just raise your hand through Zoom, and either myself or one of the organizers will call on you, and you can ask your question in that way. So it was actually, I think, the first question that was posed, Martin, which is, to what extent is the selenium deficiency related to soil erosion and poor soil quality? In the Amhara area, for example, overgrazing has been a big problem. If it is associated, it would seem that soil improvement needs to be part of the solution. Other nutrients are likely also poor related to soil quality as well. Please comment on the soil connection a little bit more.
Yeah, so thanks for that. I put a reference up earlier on in the chat. There's some very strong soil gradients appearing that link to soil type. So pH is one, soil organic matter is another strong driver. Sort of in terms of framing that in terms of the policy question as well, it comes back to this issue of what does a micronutrient survey tell you over the time scale of collection. If you're doing a snapshot view of a range of biomarkers once every 5 years, 10 years, or even longer in some instances, what does that really give you in terms of information on which to base sensible policies? And this is one of the, I think, one of the big gaps in the ag nutrition field. So what we're trying to do is really get a little bit more detail and richness on what the food systems drivers are of the evidence that comes out at the end of a micronutrient survey. And that's because there are these covariates that can give you some information from the food systems side. And then really start to then feed that back into the design of these micronutrient surveys and think about how to link up better with consumption and subnational information on food composition. And we're currently working in Zimbabwe with the government and University of Zimbabwe there on a pilot micronutrient survey that will feed into a national one hopefully next year.
And just a quick follow-up on that, Martin. You mentioned Zimbabwe, and your results are in Ethiopia. How widespread is selenium deficiency and the link with selenium deficient soils?
So in Zimbabwe, we don't know at the moment, probably very widespread based on soil types that are there. We've done the work at a nationally representative level in Malawi, and deficiency rates are greater in Malawi due to the nature of the soil types there. Whereas in Ethiopia, it's around 25 to 30% at a national level, and it's more geographically restricted, as you saw in the talk, in the Amara area. But it's also important to note that there are strong spatial trends within Amara as well as more widely.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, if anybody has somebody raising their hand, I think Francesca sent me a private message saying that she would ask her question. Let me unmute Francesca. Go ahead, Francesca.
Hi there. I don't know if I'm on video as well, but might be. I just wanted to ask, and Robert's actually posted already in the chat about this, that farmers are obviously directly involved in your study on forestry, but how much are farmers involved in other people's work, and are they just considered as part of the sort of consumers? So is it just as a farmer, are they consumers in that local community, or are they considered as tools for solutions? Thanks. Sorry, it's a bit general.
Well, I think it's something that more or less every one of the panelists could comment on and could think of. So let's start with Josiah.
Sorry, Chair, I didn't quite get the question. I only got the bit like to what extent are farmers involved, and I'm not sure whether it is involved in what I was calling the participatory forest management program. And my immediate response is that it is not all the farmers who are willing that end up getting a chance to participate. Particularly, I'm referring to the practice where farmers who are selected are given a chance to produce certain crops within the forest as part of, they would plant trees, establish trees, and within the trees they would also establish in between some crops. They are assigned smaller plots. It would be ranging from half acre to 1 acre. But participation is, of course, dependent on those who are willing, but there is an eligibility criteria, and our results tended to show that there is quite a number of willing farmers who end up getting grounded, either because they are not able to meet the eligibility criteria. The criteria here relates to one, that you must have some proximity to the forest. You must be coming from a community nearby. And of course, there are also other resource considerations, including having to pay in some money, but there is also the time that you have to put in attending meetings. So there are quite a set of factors that would prevent farmers that are otherwise willing to participate. It's true that yes, the same farmers participate again as consumers, because a number of the forests, a number of the products that are extracted from the forest, this could either be the food that is produced, but there are also wild fruits, there is honey, and a set of products, including firewood, that are sold within the local economy. And for some of the products like firewood and vegetables, there is a vibrant market for this. Sorry, I hope I'm responding to the question, because I think there is a bit I didn't quite get. Sure.
Okay. Thanks, Josiah. Does anybody else on the panel would like to respond to Francesca's question about inclusion of farmers in research?
I could say a little bit. In my study, it's a cluster randomized controlled trial where we were trying to increase the weight of babies at birth, and I think from my calculations, about 85 or maybe even more than 85% of our population were farming families. So we're in the interventions, although it was a participatory intervention working with women's groups, where we were trying to get communities to problem solve around how they would tackle the issue of low birth weight in their communities. And so many of the households were farming households. So one of the interventions that the communities came up with was planting kitchen gardens for improving dietary diversity and intake of vegetables in particular. So there we were engaging with farmers to encourage them to increase their vegetable production. But those same farmers are also consumers, because they're buying from their neighbors. There's a custom of having these local markets where people bring their produce to a locality, and everyone goes to shop there 2 or 3 times a week. So those same farmers are also consumers. They're also producers who are selling their produce. So, people fit into all those 3 categories, and I agree entirely that it's very important to engage them, especially if you're expecting them to change their diets. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. I see Paul has raised his hand. Let's give Paul a chance. And we're running almost up to time. So Paul, if you could be concise and the panelists be concise in responding, so that we can have 1 minute each to answer one last question from the chair. Paul, please go ahead.
Yes, I picked on something that somebody was inquiring earlier. I think it should have been a question on the relationship between the food trade and then also soil and nutrient conservation. And I think it entirely depends on the value chain, because there are value chains. I'll give you an example in Uganda, like banana, whereby when the product is harvested, the entire bunch and everything containing it is transported to cities, and you find that at times even the banana leaves themselves and end up going to the cities. So you find that the soils in the rural communities, whereby say the banana peels or the leaves would be able to feed back into, in order to in some way regenerate the fertility of the soil, you find that those soils miss out simply because a bulk of the product has gone to the city. Whereas some other products like maybe say coffee, whereby farmers do some bit of processing on farm, you find that they're able to retain some of the pulp, which they can actually use to help the soil regenerate. So it entirely depends on the characteristic of on the characteristic nature of the value chain. I think that's what I wish to submit.
Thanks, Paul, for that intervention. I'm not sure if Martin wants to speak specifically to the soil nutrient mining under different value chain issue.
Yeah, just very briefly, there's been some interesting work coming out in Ethiopia and also in Zimbabwe, again, looking at how sort of integrated soil fertility management can affect quality as well as productivity on soils. So there's some really neat work on from CIMMYT actually that came out on wheat and the use of woodland leaf litter, showing that good judicious use of those resources can actually improve grain quality due to effects on micronutrient availability in the soil. So there are solutions to some of these challenges.
Great. Thanks, Martin. And we just have a couple minutes before the closing ceremony. So I would like to challenge each one of the panelists to one small closing remark. I'll give you each about a minute. We'll just go in the normal order, the order that we started: Martin, Emily, Josiah, and then Naomi. And really what I would like you yeah, you're on the hot seat, Martin. What I'd really like to comment on is you've all presented very interesting interdisciplinary work that I'm sure has huge teams of scientists with different disciplinary and domain knowledge behind it. And so what have been the challenges and the opportunities sort of to create that interdisciplinary synergies that create change with this type of interdisciplinary research? And so what have you seen as really been the challenges, and what do you think are really the opportunities to to create a new type of research environment where there really is this climate or environmental degradation, agriculture, and nutrition linkages. Martin, over to you.
So it's a massive question. I'll just try and say one thing about it. One of the issues that I think is critical in this area is the simple issue of asymmetry of capacity in terms of people who are engaged in research across the board, across all research domains. And I always try and stress this point. If in Malawi, there are something like 50 people per million researchers active. In the US and most of European countries, there's around 5,000. And so the fundamental challenge and opportunity is somehow redressing that asymmetry of getting greater research capacity. And that's been the most rewarding part of the last few years for us in terms of working with local universities.
Thanks. So research capacity. Emily, same question.
All right, thank you for the question. Well, my study actually entirely depended on the secondary data, but then I will comment with the current study that we are doing with the University of Makerere and the collaborators, of course, from my institution. What I will say is that both climate change and nutrition and food system they are very complex problems that requires integration between different disciplines. So I think it presents an opportunity because if we have different people from different disciplines, we are able to integrate all this information and provide a concrete solution to all the problems that I identified before. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Josiah, final remarks.
Thanks again, Chair. When I want to thank everyone for finding time to listen to our presentations. With regard to the question you are asking, yes, we recognize, I think, the areas of climate change, food, environment present very great opportunities for people from different disciplines and different sectors to work together. One of the key issues I've seen is asymmetries in information, especially in the case of the developing countries, where you even find that different actors working within this space, be it government ministries or other non-state actors, are not quite very willing to share information, but there are a lot of opportunities to work together. Thanks so much.
So lots of opportunities. Thanks, Josiah. And we'll leave it with you, Naomi.
So thanks for the question. Actually, I do work in a lot of interdisciplinary teams, but I have one very interesting project at the moment where I'm working with some pollination scientists, and we're doing a study where we're looking at the effect of we're trying to model the effect of pollination on the availability of nutrients in diets. And the opportunities arising from this for learning from one another are tremendous. The only problem, the challenge we're facing, I would say, is we have a little bit, you know, I'm looking at the tiny minutiae of trying to describe how diets are, what compromises diets and how people consume through the year. But the climate change modelers want a kind of big picture. And so we need to, you know, we don't quite speak each other's language yet. But I think as time goes on, we're learning a lot from each other, and it's going to be a fantastic piece of work when it finally gets off the ground. But yeah, it mostly got lots of opportunities, I think. Thanks.
Thanks, Naomi. And I think with that, we'll just close. I don't think I could have said it better than Naomi just did. So, and with that hopeful message of learning and opportunity. So I wanted to thank out all of our participants and especially our speakers for their interventions today and for highlighting this important topic around environmental degradation, climate change, and its links to agriculture, nutrition, and health. So thank you very much. I think Lauren has one small comment before we sign off. Lauren, over to you.
Hi, yes, thanks everybody for your brilliant talks. Just to say, please vote for your favourite poster. We have a poster haul. I'm going to share the link in the chat now, and the winner will receive a prize. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day, evening, or night, wherever you are in the world.